Have you ever had the feeling that life is much more complicated than it could be? That there are too many subjects to learn at school, too many rules to follow at work? That we depend on more and more things, cars, cell phones, the internet? And what's more, have you ever had the feeling that this excessive complexity not only makes our day-to-day lives more difficult, but also takes our focus away from what's really essential? So, as modern as this discussion may seem, it's not new. I mean, cars and the internet are. But this feeling that we make life too complicated is something that goes back thousands of years. I'm not exaggerating. Ancient texts from Greek mythology to the Bible have already spoken about this issue. In this video then, I want to show you some of these texts, tell you some of these stories, and reflect a little on this question of the paradox of progress. I mean, why is it that even after so many inventions designed to make our lives easier, does it still seem so difficult, or even more difficult than before? And we can start this conversation by going back to Greece. When the ancient Greeks were thinking about this issue of over-civilization, so to speak, the main story that came to mind was the myth of Prometheus. One of the most controversial stories in mythology. There are several ancient versions of this myth, but in all of them, Prometheus, who is either an ancient god or a titan, appears to be responsible for having stolen fire from the heavens and given it to the race of mortals. And this event, according to the myths, is at the root of the complexity of our human condition. Because before receiving fire, our species was just one of many. We were an animal like any other, living in a state of nature. But after fire, after this gift from Prometheus, things changed completely. In a tragedy written 2,500 years ago, Prometheus himself, who is a character in this tragedy, speaks of this transformation. Hear now all the miseries of mortal men, how foolish they were in former days. Until I gave them reason and intellect, by means of celestial fire stolen from heaven. They didn't know how to make brick houses or build with wood. Instead, they lived underground like ants far from sunlight. They didn't know the seasons until I taught them about the stars. I taught them math and put letters together so they could write words. I was the first to tame wild animals and made them submit to collars and burdens, so that mortals could find relief from their heavy burdens. I was the one who designed your vessels, the ships that sailed the open sea. This is my work. Even the treasures of the earth cover iron, silver and gold, who revealed them before me. All human art comes from Prometheus. It means that, if it weren't for the technique and ingenuity that fire represents in this story, something that was once reserved only for immortals, humans would still be living in a wild state. But thanks to Prometheus they, or we, have made progress and transitioned to a civilized state. In other words, we've moved from a completely natural life to an increasingly artificial life, linked to the arts. From the most intellectual arts like astronomy, mathematics, and grammar, to more manual arts like carpentry, agriculture, and navigation. And this is something that the author of the text I just read, Aeschylus, greatly celebrates. For him, Prometheus is the great hero and benefactor of humanity. He is the one who saved us from the terror of primitive life, from a much harsher, uncertain, and unprotected reality. Thanks to his transgression, the theft of celestial fire, we have moved from the condition of mere animals to approaching the condition of gods. In other words, quite a bit of progress, at least in Aeschylus' view. However, other authors saw the story of Prometheus in a completely different light. Hesiod, for example, who is the oldest source we have on this myth, says that in fact everything was beautiful and wonderful before Prometheus. The earth was generous and gave its fruits spontaneously. A single day's work was enough to guarantee a whole year's abundance. Moreover, the gods lived among men and there was no evil, no sickness, and no suffering. And that, at least, even promised to go down in history. But how exactly is it going to have such an impact on our condition? What happened, according to Hesiod, was that on a certain occasion, mortals and immortals were about to hold a banquet. An ox was to be sacrificed and divided between them. And it was Prometheus who offered to divide the parts of the ox into two portions, one for the mortals and one for the gods. Only he promised that he was the most cunning of the titans. He put all the best parts on one side and all the worst parts on the other. Only the best pile was full of meat. He covered with the stomach of an ox, which is not at all attractive to the eye. And the worst pile, full of bones, he covered with a layer of shiny fat, much more attractive. Zeus then, representing the gods, chose the second pile and left the mortals with the first. But when he picked up his pile, which was full of bones, he saw that he had been tricked by Prometheus. And in order to harm the mortals he had promised to favor, he began to deny the fire that he himself, Zeus, had previously given to mortals. The idea here is probably that until then humans had only received the fire that came through Zeus' thunderbolts. The fire that occurred there as a result of a natural fire, and not by mastering the technique of fire. But this story obviously doesn't end there. Prometheus, in order to circumvent this limitation imposed by Zeus on mortals, went up to heaven, stole the celestial fire and delivered it directly into the hands of men. Seeing this, Zeus completely lost patience and decided to punish not only the titan who had deceived him, but also the mortals who were now masters of fire. And what were Zeus' punishments? So Prometheus was chained to a cliff. And every day Zeus sent an eagle to eat his liver. Only the liver would regenerate at night. And the next day the eagle would come back and eat his liver again. And so it was every day. And it would have been forever if it hadn't been for the fact that Hercules, in another story, kills the eagle and frees the titan. Mortals, on the other hand, were punished differently, as they had been favored with a gift stolen from Zeus by Prometheus. Zeus decided to give the mortals another gift. this time of his own free will. Only it was a real Greek gift. At least as interpreted by Hesiod. And what was this gift? Zeus sent Hephaestus, the craftsman god, to mold a clay figure according to the image of the goddesses, the likeness of the goddess's features, and bring this image to life. Then the goddess Athena taught this figure how to weave. Aphrodite taught her the art of seduction. Hermes taught her how to lie and behave as if she were pretending. And so on. All the gods gave her some gift of this nature. And that's why this figure was called Pandora, the one who received gifts, and Pan like everyone else. And so, according to Hesiod, the first woman was created. Until then, humanity was made up only of the male gender, in other words, only of men. And well, in Hesiod's not at all feminist view, let it be said, that would be punishment enough, the existence of women, whom he even calls Kalin Kakin, the beautiful evil, or a perverse and beautiful thing. But in his version of the myth of Prometheus and Pandora, the creation of the woman leads to an even worse event, which is when she, Pandora, ends up opening a mysterious jar, or a box, according to a Renaissance tradition, which ended up becoming much more popular in this tradition box, from which all the evils of the world came: sickness, pain, the need to work hard to earn a living. In other words, Hesiod, unlike Aeschylus, suggests that all the miseries of mortal men came later, and not before we mastered fire, came after we became civilized men, and not the other way around. Before Prometheus' favors, life was a paradise. Then it was all blood and sweat. And here we already see the existence of this debate, this disagreement between the Greeks. It used to be better or worse. The history of humanity is a history of progress or decadence. But before continuing this debate between the Greeks, it's worth taking a look at another ancient story, which also touches on the paradox of progress, and which was also told in the Mediterranean basin, just a few thousand kilometers east of Greece. Not the story of Prometheus and Pandora, but of another pair, Adam and Eve. The story of Adam and Eve is well known. According to the book of Genesis, Yahweh, the God of Israel, formed the first man, Adam, from the earth, Adamar, and placed this man in a garden that he himself, Yahweh, had planted. And this detail is important. It wasn't the man who planted the garden. It was God. And in this garden there were a multitude of trees from which Adam could freely feed himself, and easily ensured his sustenance. It's a situation very similar to that of Hesiod's first men, who lived in the midst of an abundant and generous nature, and barely needed to work to survive. And this situation, just like in Hesiod's story, didn't last forever either. In the story of Genesis, at a certain point, a new character enters the story, created after the first man, which is the first woman, Eve, and she ends up being tempted by the serpent, the most cunning of animals, to eat from the only forbidden tree in the garden. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil can be interpreted in various ways. Some believe that this knowledge of good and evil, or what is good and what is bad, symbolizes moral autonomy. In other words, by eating the fruit of this tree, against Yahweh's commandment, humans would be assuming the prerogative to decide for themselves what is right and what is wrong, what is valuable and what is not, instead of following the parameters established by God. But this expression of good and evil can also be read as a merism, which is a very common figure of speech in Hebrew, and in other ancient languages as well, used to refer to a set of things from two extremes. For example, heaven and earth doesn't just mean heaven and earth. It also means everything in between. It is the totality. The expression alpha and omega is also a case of this kind, which does not refer specifically only to the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. You know, the alpha, the first letter, and the omega, the last letter. The expression actually means the whole. Not just the beginning and the end, but from beginning to end. Alpha and omega mean everything. Likewise, the knowledge of good and evil, or what is good and what is bad, can also mean the knowledge of all things. Before, human beings had no knowledge at all. They were totally ignorant, like the other animals. But after eating the fruit of knowledge, they came, for example, to the knowledge that they were naked. They became aware of what the state of nakedness was, and were no longer ignorant about it. And the first thing they do to cover this condition of nakedness, which they now know after eating the fruit of knowledge, is to intertwine some fig leaves and make a kind of loincloth to cover himself. This, by the way, is the first artifact to appear in the history of the Bible. In other words, the first work of human ingenuity. It could represent the way out, the beginning of the exit from the state of nature towards civilization, or the departure from life in the garden to life in the cities, which is in fact what will happen next. But this transition won't be subtle at all, neither pleasant nor voluntary, because Yahweh is not going to be happy with this new situation for humans. According to this story, shortly after Adam and Eve had eaten from the tree of knowledge, Yahweh goes out into the garden looking for them and they hide. But eventually Adam gives up his position and God asks him, "Why did you hide?" He shrinks back and says, "I was afraid, because I'm naked." And Yahweh immediately asks, "Who told you that you were naked?" I mean, Yahweh knew that the man, in his original condition, would not have this knowledge. It was clear what had happened. And then Yahweh says, "Then you ate from the tree that I forbade you to eat from." At that moment, God, Yahweh, decided to expel the couple from the garden and also put some curses on the transgressors, including the serpent who started the whole mess. From that moment on, the deceitful serpent would be condemned to crawl on its own belly every day. The woman would have the pains of childbirth multiplied and would be totally subjected to her husband's domination. And man would have to sweat to earn his bread, his daily sustenance. Comparing it to Hesiod's story, the myth of Prometheus, according to him, is as if Pandora's hands had lifted the lid off the jar. Only here it's Eve's mouth opening the forbidden fruit that inaugurates a new world of blood and sweat for humanity. A world that is no longer that idealized image of the good savage, of simple days, of hunter-gatherers, but the world of sedentary society, agricultural, who have to work very hard to get their food from the ground and who eventually have to take from the ground to start building their walls and houses. And this transition, in fact, will begin in the very next generation, with the children of Adam and Eve, according to the book of Genesis. After Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, they have two sons, Cain and Abel. Abel was a sheepherder and Cain was a farmer. And on one occasion, each of them makes an offering to Eve. Abel offers meat and fat, and Cain offers produce from the land. For some reason, which is a subject of endless discussion from ancient times to the present day, in which Yahweh is pleased with Abel's offering but rejects Cain's offering. Because of this, Cain becomes very angry and ends up killing his brother. Some see this story as a polemic between two forms of worship, and more specifically sacrifice. Animal sacrifice, on the one hand, preferred by the priests of the Jerusalem temple, represented by Abel, and the agricultural offerings, typical of the peasants of Judah, represented by Cain. But there are also those who interpret this story as an opposition. Not two forms of worship, but two ways of life, or two types of society. Pastoral nomadism, on the one hand, represented by Abel, the shepherd, and agricultural sedentarism, the forerunner of what would become urban life. But ahead, represented by Cain. Be that as it may, the fact is that the text goes on to say that Cain, the first murderer in history, will become a city builder, and one of his descendants, Tubal-Cain, the father of all copper and iron rolling mills. In other words, the father of metallurgists, of the lords of fire. And from then on, humanity's situation will only get worse, when men began to be numerous on the face of the earth. The text says, "The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and took them as their wives." Once again, there are several possible interpretations here, but one of the oldest and most widespread readings is that these sons of God, the Bene Elohim, are celestial beings, who will not only cross paths with mortals, with women, with the daughters of men, but will also pass on to them a series of skills and techniques, in the best Prometheus style. The Book of Enoch, for example, which is a Jewish text from the 3rd century, more or less before Christ, expands on this passage from Genesis as follows. According to the Book of Enoch, the sons of God took wives of all those they chose and began to live with them and defile themselves with them, and taught them spells and incantations and showed them how to handle roots and herbs. Azazel, one of these sons of God, taught the men to make swords of iron and breastplates of bronze, every weapon for war. He showed them the metals of the earth, how to work gold, create ornaments and work silver. And the text goes on to say that the angels who didn't join in the fun, like Michael, Raphael and Gabriel, observed this situation from heaven and lamented to God, saying the following: "You see, O God, what Azazel has done. He revealed the eternal mysteries prepared in heaven and made them known to mankind." In other words, the idea here is that this knowledge belonged exclusively to heaven, but thanks to a transgression, in this case the fallen angels, humans ended up taking possession of this knowledge. And they are knowledge. Very useful knowledge. Metallurgy, hebology, which is very close to medicine in this context. Astronomy also appears in another passage. But these are skills that appear in history as things that do not contribute to the real progress of humanity. But quite the opposite. It is in this context, even going back to the book of Genesis, that Yahweh will see that man's wickedness was great on earth. And he will say, "I will make the men I have created disappear from the surface of the earth, because I repent of having made them." And that's where the story of the flood comes in, which will wipe humanity off the earth with the exception of one man and his family, which is Noah's family. Curiously, even in Greco-Roman texts, Zeus is also going to launch a flood against the human race, and only one man or woman will survive, which is Deucalion and Pyrrha, and that too with the help of a boat. Back to the focus. After the flood, Noah and his family have several children and repopulate the earth. But God's reset of humanity doesn't seem to work out very well. Because very quickly, the next chapter, people are already playing with fire again. The text says that some men began to migrate east, more specifically to the southeast of Mesopotamia. And there they began to say to each other, "I've come from, let's make bricks and fire them. Let's build a city, a tower whose top reaches into the heavens." And when Yahweh heard this, he immediately came down from heaven to see the city and concluded, really, this was just the beginning of their initiatives. Now no plan would be unrealizable for them. And so to stop this new Promethean daring based on human ingenuity in building skills, arts, science, etc., He confuses the language of the people who spoke only one language and scatters the group over the entire face of the earth. This is the story, of course, that everyone knows as the Tower of Babel, but you see that the problem wasn't just the tower, but the city as a whole. The text says, and Yahweh scattered them from there over the whole face of the earth, and they stopped building the city, not just the Tower of Babel. And this city that the authors have in mind there is Babylon, or Babel, in Hebrew, which the authors associated by making a pun with the word Baal, which means to mix. Or sometimes it's also translated as confuse. In other words, Babel would be the city of confusion. It's the city of walls, palaces and ziggurats. Monumentality, writing, artisans, studies of the stars, military strategies, doctors, legal codes. But despite all this, or perhaps precisely because of all this, it is the cursed city, the city of confusion, the city of vanity. According to all this history, then, the trajectory of humanity, from fig tree thongs to urban megacenters, has not been a story of ascent, but of decline. The mastery of technology ultimately led to no progress in ethics. And the more knowledge we gained, the more power we accumulated, and the more power we accumulated, the more destruction we caused. What's more, the more sophisticated life has become, the more futile and distracted it became. And at this point, we can go back to Greece and continue that discussion about the paradox of progress and the myth of Prometheus, now told by two other philosophers, Plato and Diogenes the Cynic, in a dialogue called Protagoras. From the 4th century BC, Plato tells the following story about Prometheus and the theft of fire. In the beginning, there were only the gods, but eventually the time came to create mortal creatures. And when that time came, the gods mixed fire with earth and began to form the first species of creatures. Two titans, Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus, were responsible for giving each of these creatures their own qualities. Epimetheus, who was most enthusiastic about the task, asked his brother to do this part himself, and Prometheus would only be responsible for reviewing the task. And from then on, Epimetheus began to distribute the qualities of the various mortal creatures. Some he gave weapons such as claws and fangs. Others he gave speed to escape from those he had armed, to the smaller ones he gave wings, or the ability to dig underground refuges to escape from the bigger ones, to those who would live in the coldest places. And to the most vulnerable he gave more fertility to ensure the conservation of the species. Everything always respected this criterion of compensation. The problem was that it was our turn. The humans' turn to receive qualities. There was nothing left. As the text says, man found himself naked without shoes, coverings, or weapons. And if nothing was done, he wouldn't last among the other creatures. And that's where Prometheus comes in, to prevent our species from becoming extinct. Prometheus climbed up to the abode of the gods and stole from them the wisdom of the arts along with fire, and gave it to men. And from there, according to the text, it wasn't long before men began to coordinate sounds and words, to engineer houses, clothes, shoes, and beds, and to search the earth for food. In other words, through art, through the artificial, we began to make everything we needed to survive, thus compensating for that initial physical fragility. And so far, this version of the myth of Prometheus is very similar to that version by Aeschylus, which has Prometheus as a savior and a hero. But in Plato's version, things are a little more complicated, because the technical progress that comes from divine fire not only doesn't completely solve our problem, but also ends up creating new complications. This is because, even after receiving the fire, humans remained scattered and disorganized, and so they were unable to produce anything really significant capable of protecting our species in the fight against the other animals. To really make the most of this gift of technology, humans would have to get together and create an organized society. And that's exactly what they eventually did by founding the first cities. Now, as I said, this solution is going to end up becoming a problem. But why? The point is that, according to this story, the creation of cities and complex societies worked very well to save us from external threats. But it ended up generating a new threat, the internal threat. The social threat, the one that remained inside the walls. We humans ourselves. From then on, our enemies would no longer be the lion, the bear, or the snake, but the neighbor, the boss, the thief. That's because, according to Plato's dialogue, he gave us various arts. But one fundamental art was missing, which is an art that only Zeus could give, which is the art of politics, the art of living in community. And there's another problem with this issue of technical progress, which is something that another philosopher will comment on, who is a philosopher contemporary with Plato called Diogenes the Cynic, or Diogenes the Dog. Diogenes, originally, was from the city of Sinope, a Greek colony in Asia Minor, but he ended up being expelled from there and ended up in Athens, from where he was also expelled and ended up in Corinth, and that was after he'd already been captured by pirates and been through a series of other ordeals. In the meantime, Corinth was one of the richest and most sophisticated cities in Greece. Diogenes, on the other hand, was one of the poorest and most uncivilized philosophers, so to speak, of Greece. According to his namesake, the ancient historian Diogenes Laertius, Diogenes lived on the street and slept in an old ceramic jar. He despised wealth, material possessions, etiquette, public honor, and preferred to follow his natural instincts than social conventions. Some even say that he did his business in public and ate indecently in the market. That's why some called him Diogenes the Dog or Diogenes the Cynic, from the Greek word kinos, Dog, that is, in the view of some civilized people. Diogenes was not a man, but an animal. And Diogenes himself didn't always reject this opinion. Sometimes he even took it as a compliment. Because unlike the townspeople, the dogs at least were honest, simple. They lived according to their own nature and were able to face adversity with much more courage and dignity than the humans who, according to Diogenes, had lost themselves in the luxury of Corinth's material progress and Greek civilization, or perhaps even human civilization in general. And it is precisely from this philosophy that Diogenes comments on the myth of Prometheus. According to him, after receiving the fire of Prometheus, men first gathered in cities so that they wouldn't suffer from outside evils, but then they turned and committed all sorts of evils against each other and committed the most atrocious deeds, as if that had been the purpose of the union. And so far there's nothing Plato hasn't already said. But Diogenes goes further. For him, this Promethean humanity, that humanity after the fire of Prometheus, after technology, reason and ingenuity, this humanity was not only more violent than the previous one, but paradoxically it was also weaker, softer. According to him, the discovery and granting of fire was the origin and starting point of weakness and futility among men. Zeus certainly didn't hate men, nor did they deny him any good. Zeus, according to Diogenes, had nothing to do with the worsening of the human condition. Contrary to what Hesiod had said, Zeus did not inflict any punishment on humanity because of Prometheus' transgression. It was because humans themselves accepted the gift stolen from heaven and condemned themselves. Diogenes says that man's cunning in having discovered and conceived so many inventions has been of little benefit to life in subsequent times, because men do not use intelligence to promote virtue and justice, but rather to seek pleasure. And so, by the very fact of seeking pleasure above all else, their lives become less and less enjoyable and more tiring. And while they imagine that they are acting with foresight towards their own interests, they perish miserably because of this access to worry and foresight. So, in all fairness, I said that welfare was tied to the rock and its liver is attacked by the eagle. And there's a play on words here. The name Prometheus literally means the one who sees before, in other words, the one who thinks before, who has foresight, who premeditates. The vision of Plato, a philosopher whom Diogenes detested. And this is interpreted positively. Prometheus' brother, Prometheus, is the one who distributes the characteristics of creatures without having done all the planning and ends up leaving humans with nothing. He acts first and then thinks he's a fool. Prometheus, on the other hand, is the one capable of first creating a plan to save humans from extinction and then actually following it through. He thinks and then acts, he is wise. But Diogenes takes a different view of this name. For him, premeditation, or thinking ahead, preoccupation, is precisely what has ended human peace. This is the reason for all the anxiety and weariness of civilized life. There are so many plans, precautions and inventions to make life easier, that actually end up, in the end, making it more difficult. It may even be that at first a great invention seems to lighten our load, or in fact it does. Something that was difficult becomes easy. But once you get used to the new situation, it becomes normal. That feeling of relief passes and our attention turns again to all the endless problems that remain. And even worse, once you get used to a new facility, we tend to become dependent on it. And if that facility is taken away from us, it seems impossible to live without it, as if we hadn't lived without it before. It's a terrible suffering, much greater than when that facility simply didn't exist. As they say, taste doesn't go back. Or as the poet William Blake put it, to put it a little more sophisticatedly, less than everything will not satisfy man. And this philosophy is also very much present in the Bible, particularly in the book of Ecclesiastes, which says, for example, that the eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor is the ear satisfied with hearing, let alone knowledge. The more suffering, he who loves silver will never be tired of silver. All man's work is for his mouth, and yet his appetite is never satisfied. Or even in a passage particularly reminiscent of Diogenes, the dog, I think of men in this way. God puts them to the test to show them that they are animals. Because the fate of man and animal is identical. As one dies, the other dies, and both have the same breath. Man has no advantage over the animal, because everything is vanity. Now, all that said, what can we do to resolve the paradox of progress? Give up the benefits of civilization and return as far as possible to a state of nature? So this is a path that few people have actually taken, but which appears a lot out there as a dream, a utopia. We see it a lot in TV shows like Naked and Afraid, Surviving in Alaska, or in YouTube videos that teach you how to fish with your hand or make fire with a stick. These are images of a simpler life, guided by what is necessary. Only what is necessary, without the premeditations, anxieties, bureaucracies and political disagreements of Promethean life. But these are idealized images. Hunter-gatherers didn't start settling in fields and then cities for nothing. Nor was the history of science and technology driven purely by futility or vanity. If you ask someone who, out of necessity, fishes by hand and makes fire with a stick, if they would accept a pneumatic harpoon or a lighter, for example, the chances are very high that they would. Technical progress really does make a lot of things easier. It saves lives, cures terrible diseases, relieves a lot of really heavy burdens. But again, it also creates new difficulties. Suffering, anguish. It really is a paradox. The paradox of progress is not a difficult problem to solve. It is, in fact, paradoxical. It has no solution. At least it seems that way to me. Because we are paradoxical. The human condition is paradoxical. As a historian called Conrad Hyers wrote, luminous specks that we delight in both creativity and simplicity, in novelty and repetition, conquest and harmony, aspiration and nostalgia, excitement and tranquility, the new and the old. Primitive life doesn't satisfy. Civilized life doesn't satisfy. All versions of the Prometheus myth are true. They are contradictory and they are true. And they are true because they are contradictory. Because our human condition is contradictory. As Ecclesiastes says, don't say why past times were better than now. It's not wisdom that makes you raise this question. The situation now is what it is, the curse has already been cast. Your bread will be eaten in the sweat of your brow. God has said, in place of fire, I will give evil, said Zeus. But still, in all the work, I profit, says the book of Proverbs. And work is no honor, says Hesiod. It seems that these ancient texts, while recognizing the imperfection of the human condition, which is even considered a curse, they accept this imperfection. There's a certain calling, you could say, to say goodbye to our curse. To assume the paradox of the human condition, to live the tension of extremes, without seeking refuge in any of them, neither in the purely natural, nor in the purely artificial. Not only in emotions, but also not only in reason. Not only in the spontaneity of a dog, but also in the formality of a noble citizen. Anyway, these are just a few possible reflections on these ancient Greek and biblical stories. These texts, of course, have been interpreted infinitely ways over time, and will certainly continue to be interpreted in other ways over the coming decades, centuries, or even millennia. But that's all I wanted to say, at least for now. Let us know what you think about these issues in the comments. And look out for other related videos raising new points of view. And thanks very much for your time. And I'll see you in future videos. Goodbye.